Hey, I'm Gina. Welcome to the Oh, There's More podcast, a space to get real and go deep. No more just checking the boxes and going through the motions. It's time to live out the beautiful life that God has written for you. On today's episode, we'll talk about boundaries, the purpose of them, and why having them can actually strengthen your relationships. As this season is going to wrap up very soon, I was just thinking about in my past how I used to want to be seen as like the fun person or the really sweet, loving person. And I was reminded time and time again by God of who He created me to be. And that sure, those were qualities that I carried. But one of the main reasons He created me was to be a voice to pave the way for others and to help to bring awareness to things. And I just want to say that if you're here and you're listening to this podcast and you're getting something out of it, and that's why you've continued to return, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for wanting to hear something other than the just really good, cheerful, happy stuff. That's great. I need it personally. I'm sure you do too. And I just honor you for wanting to hear stuff that can be hard. I know what a journey healing is, and I know how many times I have cried tears of anger and sadness and frustration over just the difficulty of it. And so I just honor you for wanting to go through those things so that you can be a more healthy and healed person, both emotionally and spiritually. So with all that said, let's get into today's episode on boundaries. I want to know if the word no is a hard one for you to say. Like, do you feel obligated to say yes when someone asks, hey, can you help me with this? Even though you don't have the time or the resources or whatever the case may be? Or are you able to say, thank you so much for asking, but I'm not able to? Side note here, before we even go any further, I want to tell you that no is a complete sentence. You don't have to try to explain yourself so that the other person understands. There's no long explanation needed behind those two letters. If you can't or simply don't want to, that's okay, and no is enough. So let's start by talking about what boundaries even are, because I'm sure that we've all experienced some unhealthy interactions with people that were labeled as boundaries, but were in fact just control or manipulation. Boundaries are limits or guidelines or even rules on how you'd like to be treated, both by others and by yourself, which I promise you I'll explain. Boundaries can be physical, something like I don't want to be touched that way, or they can be emotional, something like thank you for loving my kids, but I don't desire for you to speak into how I'm parenting them. Boundaries can also be around your personal space or time, like I need to keep my home peaceful, so drinking here is something that we just don't have. Or having limits on how long you spend with someone who's hard to be around for longer periods of time. Like, yes, we will totally come see you for Christmas, but we will only be there from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And, you know, when we don't voice the boundaries that we have and we just let people cross them or allow ourselves to operate outside of them, we end up in this position of feeling really resentful and exhausted, even mad. There's nothing positive that's going to come out of having your boundaries crossed all the time. And setting boundaries with others may include some uncomfortable conversations and even pushback from others. I know that's not always easy, especially if it hasn't gone well in the past. When you experience blow-ups and negative reactions, or if you simply weren't allowed to have an opinion, this can feel really hard to do. Or if you've had to hold it together for the sake of your family as a kid, to keep the peace because the storms are raging all around you, this can be hard. It may feel like if you speak up, you're going to put everything around you in upheaval. And so instead, you just take the hit again and again, forsaking your own peace, the peace that you will actually find when you set boundaries, when you say no, when you identify what's going to work for you and what isn't. And it's not about being selfish either. Chances are that's not an issue for you in these areas where you've struggled to say no. If boundaries have been hard for you to set in the past, if saying no has been hard for you, then the chances of you being a selfish person are kind of slim. You're the person that goes out of your way, that goes the extra mile, that bends over backwards, that inconveniences themselves for other people. So let's maybe not worry about that whole selfish thing being an issue right now. And I know it's something even within the culture of the church that we just say yes to whatever is asked, right? We give of ourselves to no end. I'm not saying to not volunteer or to not give of yourselves, but what I am saying is just because somebody asks does not mean you have to say yes. And in fact, I would encourage you to only be saying yes to the things that you're meant to say yes to. Why? Because you have certain things in your life that you're responsible for, certain things in your life that only you can do, certain gifts and things that God has given to you, and places that you're supposed to use those. So if you're saying yes to things that are outside of what you're supposed to be doing, that means that you don't have the time or the bandwidth to be able to say yes in the places that you were supposed to. It ties you up in ways and places where you weren't meant to be. There is a book called Boundaries, and I read it probably close to maybe 7-8 years ago. Fun little fact about me, I can remember useless numbers like my old phone number pre-cell phone days, but what's in books or movies or shows or even the names of songs and artists that I am currently listening to, I don't retain that information. So I'll just say that I can't remember a lot about the book right now at this point in my life. However, I do remember that it helped me understand what boundaries were in a much better way so that I was able to start setting some, or even to just see where like, oh, okay, these are places that I'm probably going to need to set some boundaries, and then I could get myself ready to be able to do that. Boundaries are a way to honor yourself and to honor the people that you're in relationship with. Whether that be friends, family members, kids, coworkers, your spouse, and ourselves. And this may surprise you, but true self-care can oftentimes include setting boundaries. I know that personally, in order to feel my best, I need to do certain things like get a certain amount of sleep, avoid certain foods. I need to spend time outside during the day, taking in something beautiful, having my windows open, or at least my shades open, and being able to see outside. There are things that you know help you be your best each day, and others you know that don't help you. And it's up to us to set those boundaries in our own lives with ourselves. You may find that as you begin to heal, you need more boundaries for a period of time. I had to set some really firm ones in place for a while at the beginning of this journey. And as those boundaries were reinforced when they needed to be, and then the years passed, it's actually created the space in those relationships for us to love and respect each other in much greater ways. Those boundaries that were put in place stopped the things that felt hurtful and disrespectful. And that allowed the relationship between me and the other person to actually get a lot better. See, if others don't know where that line is for you, then it's going to be hard for them to honor you in the way that you need to be honored, or to love you in the way that you need to be loved. It's much more kind and loving in our relationships if we make people aware of those things, not in a mean way, but to just say, hey, this is how this works for me. These are the parameters in which I need our relationship to function in. And then that person is aware. Boundaries say, I love myself enough to honor my needs, and I love you enough to communicate what those are so that you're not crossing the lines and causing harm when maybe that wasn't ever your intention. I wouldn't have guessed that this would be the outcome from setting boundaries either. That I would do something hard that actually feels like I'm pushing somebody away. And it actually did the opposite because it made that relationship more defined and clear about what was acceptable and what wasn't. So here we are looking at yet another thing that is really hard to do and yet brings such a great reward on the other side of it. Just like this whole journey of healing and becoming healthier. When we say yes and we decide to do the hard thing, like set boundaries in those relationships that we need to, it's incredible what happens on the other side of it. We do the hard thing and we reap the reward on the other side. And you'll find that as you do this more often, it's not as hard. It's easier to be honest with the people around you and just say, hey, you know what? I really love you. And I really appreciate you. Thank you for loving me. But I'm going to have to ask you just to not speak into that area of my life. Or I would love to see you, but we can meet somewhere and I'm going to have to ask you to stay sober when you're with me. Or even in dating, this is a really important place to have boundaries, right? For me, there's no sex outside of marriage. And so unless we're married, that means there's going to have to be some serious boundaries put in place in that relationship. Like not being alone together in each other's house, not laying in bed together, not putting ourselves in positions where we may compromise the values that we're trying to stand firm in. Boundaries let people know what your expectations are, where the lines are at, and they show people how to directly love and honor you well. Boundaries help us to have better communication. They help us to let people know, hey, this is where my line is. I love you and I love myself enough to speak up about it. They're also really important to have in relationships where there is some maladaptive or also known as toxic things going on, just unhealthy behavior happening, whether that be emotionally or in some other way, right? If you've got a family member or a friend that's manipulative in a certain way, it's important for you to set boundaries if you want to continue to be in relationship with them. Because it lets them know, hey, this isn't okay. This cannot be a part of our relationship in order for us to be close. And then if those boundaries aren't honored, then you know what? You say, hey, this is my boundary. You restate it again and you let them know, I'm not okay with this. If you're going to do this, then we aren't going to be able to have a friendship, or we aren't going to be able to spend time together, or whatever your condition is for that boundary. You let them know, hey, this isn't working for me, and if you want to continue to be in relationship with me, this is what I'm going to need from you. Boundaries are also something that help us take ownership, right? If I have boundaries, that means I'm taking ownership for how I'm going to spend my time, who I'm going to let into my life and into the intimate places of my life. It means that you are also going to do the same. You're going to take responsibility for the things in your life. It's that line that says, this is where I stop and this is where you begin. And it allows people to operate more freely in their life and their relationships. And I feel like I've said this multiple times already, but I want to restate it. The purpose of boundaries is so you can love and honor both others and yourself well. They're not meant to be put in place out of a mean-spirited heart. They're not meant to be put in place to inflict harm on somebody else or to control them. Both the purpose and the intended outcome is just the opposite of those. So maybe go grab that book. There's a link on my site, ginapeak.com/recommended-books, or just go to the homepage and click resources in the menu. And take time to see where you may need to set some boundaries. Maybe it's easier to start with setting some for yourself first. That's great. Start there. And then maybe the next step is pausing before you just say yes to everything that people in your life ask of you. Be a help when and where you can, but not at the expense of honoring your own boundaries. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share it with your people. You can go to my website, ginapeak.com, to find extra resources and info. Until next time.